The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or to view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
And I think it's a nice topic to end the semester because in a way it brings together, I think, some of the main threads that we've traveled through the semester, but also, in fact, the last word of the title, liberation, actually might point us to a way to the future. So without further ado, we have Lorraine, Will, and Cynthia.
So this is our presentation on language, resistance, and liberation. Welcome to the last day of class. Congratulations for getting this far. Okay. So as a roadmap, we're going to go through first Rethinking Literacy, the dialogue, the piece by Ferry and Macedo. And then we're going to look at the literacy and critical pedagogy piece, and then end with the MIT Haiti initiatives.
Okay, so this is just a little bit of a background on the writers of the first two pieces. Both of them are educators in critical pedagogy, and one's from Brazil and one is Cape Verdean American.
So in the first piece, Ferry mentions the main premises of culture, and I think that these are really important to keep in mind because this is a really interesting and I think powerful way to frame culture. The first one is that cultural processes are intimately connected with social relations, especially with class relations and class formations, with sexual divisions, with racial structuring of social relations, and with age oppressions as a form of dependency. Got it? Okay. The second one. Culture involves power and helps to produce asymmetries in the abilities of individuals and social groups to define and realize their needs. And third one. Culture is neither autonomous nor an externally determined field, but a site of social difficulties and struggles. Those ideas are really important to keep in mind because this paper also raises this idea, I know it as the social field, which is kind of the combination of all of the beliefs, myths, aspirations, hopes of a society, of a culture. And so it includes things such as why racial hierarchies exist, to why sexual divisions exist, and like what roles gendered people play in a society. And it's really important to keep that in mind because if you're able to keep that in mind, then you're able to think critically about that, and through the critical process of engaging with it, you're able to change the social field. And so I think that that's important because even though this paper raises a lot of really powerful ideas, it's still not perfect. So one of the quotes from this paper is, "Literacy's oral dimension is important even if it takes place in a culture like that of the United States, whose memory is predominantly written, not oral like that of Africa." Africa is not a country. And so something like that is also part of the social field and would make it into this paper because even though Ferry and Macedo are thinking critically about this, they are not engaging with the full reality of cultural objectivity and being subjects within that.
Yeah, so in the next article, Paulo Freire talks about the use of language as a form of resistance, and he first starts talking about how the current traditional methods of literacy, how they tend to ignore the importance of language in a person's education. And he bases a lot of his theories on his experiences, and from the second quote, he says that the sad reality is that while education in Portuguese provides access to positions of political and economic power for the high echelon of African society, it screens out the majority of the masses who fail to learn Portuguese well enough to acquire the necessary literacy skills for social, economic, and political advancement. And you could definitely, from the way that he mentions this, you could definitely see a lot of like parallelisms between what's going on around the world and currently like in the United States. And you could you could definitely see that that the 1% usually have the most control over things, and that they usually tend to drive how policies are made. But the fact is that when a person is taught in their native language, they tend to learn things better and comprehend things faster. And if you go to the next slide, there's usually backlash when it comes to different languages taught in schools. For example, in the US, people say that students should learn how to speak standard American English, but when it comes to providing these sort of opportunities to minority groups of, I guess, for instance, like students of color, there's usually some racial tensions that develop that make minority students feel inferior. For example, there was an article mentioned of recently in March of 2017 that talked about a robotics team that recently had won a challenge, and the fact that after they had won, students, or I guess people in the crowd, started screaming at them and telling them to go back to Mexico. And so this form of demeaning commentary tends to drive the dropout rates of minority groups, and all this tends to contribute to the school to prison pipeline. And as you can see in the infographic, it definitely gives a lot of percentages that talks about this sort of issue. But you can see in the bottom when it says that 68% of all males in state and federal prison, they do not have a high school diploma, and this tends to be give statistics on students of color. And all of this tends to stem from the fact that minority students do not have the same access to education as the elite part of society. And from personal experience, I could definitely relate to this. I went to a school about an hour and a half from my house, and I definitely did have a lot of good role models growing up, but there were definitely students around my neighborhood that definitely didn't have the same access to the same opportunities that I did. Some of them did drop out to start working. Others were influenced by gangs around my neighborhood, and you could definitely things are definitely getting better, but things could definitely be improved from an emancipatory literacy approach, which is what Paulo Freire mentions. Yeah, so in emancipatory literacy, this involves using the language of the people rather than the elite to teach students to accept their experiences and their culture. And this moves from the world of objectivity to the world of subjectivity, where individuals learn to accept themselves for who they are rather than feel like they're a victim of society. And Paulo Freire does mention that achieving emancipatory literacy is hard, but it's not impossible. And now, Lorraine will talk about a few examples of how this is being used today.
So considering specifically the case of Haiti, which Michelle works a lot on with MIT Haiti Initiative, virtually all of the schooling in both K through 12 education and then in higher education is done in French and not in Creole. But the problem is that most people only speak Creole fluently, so 95% or so, and very few people speak French fluently at all. So when you go through school and everything is in a language that you don't understand, how are you supposed to be able to actually get any of the education, get any of the social engagement, especially if children are punished for speaking Creole in school and they can't interact with each other, can't ask questions, can't gather any of the information that's coming at them. So it's based on this false belief and really outdated belief about the hierarchy of languages, about which languages are created or are younger or anything like that, and that Creole isn't developed enough to be able to be used for technical language, for STEM education, to have anything translated into Creole. And part of that is saying that Creole isn't widespread enough, even though Creole has almost 10 million speakers. Finnish has only about 5.5 million speakers, and yet in Finland, all of the education is done in Finnish. And studies have found that in Finland, kids are much better equipped to be able to learn a second language and to go into higher education and gather all of these technical studies because all of their education is done in Finnish. And over IAP, I was doing MISTI GTL in the Catalonia region in Spain, and there Catalan also has a little under 10 million speakers, but in Catalonia, all of the education is in Catalan, which made it difficult for me as like a Spanish speaker, like not even fluent, but trying to speak Spanish speaker, to be able to teach the students. But they had such a better experience with all of their textbooks in Catalan, all of their computer software. So I was trying to teach them Inkscape and GIMP, but everything was in Catalan, and I just couldn't understand like even how to open a window. So they taught me a lot about this, and all of them speak Catalan and Spanish and English, and then they can like learn German or French on the side as well. So all of them, because their initial education, K through 12 and then higher education, if they want it to be, is in Catalan, then they can learn all of these other things just as well as we do, like in English, which is mostly our one and kind of only language in the United States. Yeah, so that was my experience. And what a school that is like a really good model in Haiti is the LKM school. I didn't know how to pronounce it in Creole, so it's LKM. It's a K through 10 school in a rural part on an island of Haiti, and their education is starting to be in this model of all Creole education, trying to teach all of these subjects, all of the technical terms in Creole, and the students are learning much better than the rest of the students in Haiti whose schooling is in French and who only 10% graduate from high school. So the linguistic apartheid part of this is that when you teach somebody in a language they don't understand, you prevent them from being able to move into different socioeconomic classes to attain the education and the success that they should be able to. And this all leads to the MIT Haiti initiative that Michelle started here between MIT and all the Haitian education systems. So a couple of their main points are to teach educators in Haiti that teaching in Creole is perfectly fine, that it is actually better for the students, that it gives them more opportunities, and that STEM and technical subjects can be taught in Creole. So a lot of the worries or concerns are that like Creole doesn't have words for these languages. We didn't have words for a computer either up until when they were created. A lot of other languages borrow words from other languages. So I learned Japanese, and in Japanese there's this lovely thing called katakana where you just grab words from other languages. So if you don't know how to pronounce it, you kind of like make it sound like it, and oftentimes it is what has been borrowed. So for example, bread is pan from German, and all of these other languages have words borrowed from other languages, and that's what globalization does. So the same thing should be able to happen with Creole and STEM learning. And the really good results of this are that they affirm students' cultures and backgrounds and their own upbringings and how the society actually works as opposed to a colonial oppressive society. And it equalizes students being able to have more social mobility and to attain what they want and what they should be able to.
So to kind of tie this back to what we can do to stay woke with regards to literacy, I think it's important to remember that language is a mediating force of knowledge, but it is also knowledge itself. And so one approach is for groups to kind of come together and create a language that describes their experience amongst themselves, and then to share that language and to share that experience in their own language. And I think that that is one way that we can start breaking away from the kind of putting standard English on a pedestal, and can also kind of validate other discourses and other ways of being and other just languages that kind of already exist in the US and across the world. Got some questions. Okay. How have our understandings of literacy evolved in response to the internet, unprecedented global integration, and increased pressure to preserve human rights? For example, what does it mean that schools repress the development of subjectivity but do largely ensure literacy? How can modern notions of literacy evolve to address phenomena such as the proliferation of fake news? So if we're moving past literacy as just the idea of being able to read, and we are entering this new kind of this new way of being that's largely pushed by the internet and the influence of technology on the way we live, literacy is coming to mean a more critical approach to life in the sense that fake news is a thing, and it's actually quite hard to distinguish what news is real and what news is fake. And the ability to do that, having that critical lens, is maybe the next evolution of literacy. So, any ideas on that, I guess, is the question.
So I'm just going to answer the first part of this because I'm not sure if I have an answer for the next two, but something that I think is kind of hilarious about like the integration of the internet is that I think it's simultaneously making us more literate and less literate. So like, or like pressuring you to be more literate. So pressuring you to be more literate is like now there's a bunch of sources that you can read, and like now you can be more educated and it's all open to the public if you have a computer. And then there's also like the pressure to speak English properly based off either like there's one viral video of this old grandma screaming at this Hispanic woman in an IHOP because she was paying in Spanish or something like that. So like it puts pressure on you to speak English correctly. And then meanwhile, because of like things like Facebook and like any social media, people like don't speak English correctly. Like typing like, abbreviations and stuff that's acceptable in text, but like meanwhile we're saying like you should speak English properly. So it's kind of a weird dichotomy.
I'm interested in the age implications of what you just said, kind of aligning kind of a critique towards the use of different varieties of English with older generations and the use of non-standard varieties of English with younger generations. I'm interested in that.
Yeah, I think, I guess like, so like there's a grandma that I know that's on Facebook and like she like makes sure to like type everything out, including punctuation, and like her Facebook posts are longer and like they're more like here's a card like type thing. Whereas like my Facebook, A, I'm just sharing things, but B, if I write anything, it's probably not in proper English. So I think it does depend on like your age group, but also like going back to the original point of like, that grandma screaming at the Hispanic woman and like in an IHOP, like it's not just like an older woman screaming because, she's more literate. Like there's also like kids who like think like, oh, you have to speak English here. So like there still is that weirdness between like how like older people like act on Facebook and stuff like that, but I still think like the point of, pressuring people is regardless of age.
I think because of the way that we've talked about language versus dialects in this class, I would kind of risk saying that we're kind of creating a new language because of the internet with like all the abbreviations and things and the way the push for speed and everything like that.
Yeah.
So I think the reason that older generations don't use it as much is because they're not used to it and they're like in a different like frame of reference and they just haven't like learned this new dialect that we're starting to use. So I think that it's a good thing in a sense, but a lot of people who want that standard American English are going to be pushing us to go back to that as opposed to using the internet language. But going as far as like our changes in literacy because of the internet, like I didn't know that The Onion was satire at first. I just didn't know that The Onion existed. And then when I found out, I realized that it was satire. I think that nuance like that is something that you miss, especially with the internet, because you can't really express sarcasm very clearly over just plain text. And I think that's something that we're like struggling with because of the internet now.
But I think now that you talked about The Onion, I think that shows like the Stephen Colbert, or the Colbert Report, and shows like that show that we have been dealing with that sort of satire language issue because for a long time people who watched the Colbert Report didn't realize that it was satire. So I think that we've done this before, and it's sort of a different cycle. Now it's on the internet instead of being on TV.
I wanted to bounce off what you originally said, like with like, it's not a bad thing that we're typing that way, which I agree with, like, it's kind of like, another dialect, as you mentioned. Do you think, like, there are certain rules to, like, the way we type, and, like, is there, like, a way to be literate, like, with our new abbreviations and stuff?
I think there definitely is, like, for instance, punctuating sentences with like LOL or haha, like the beginning of the end, like where you put that, using emojis to get more emotion in it. Like there's definitely like a science to it that we kind of all just like fell into but didn't realize was there's a grammar behind it.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. I'm just interested.
My question is, so knowing now that people grow up in a type of literacy, whether it's traditional or emancipatory, what are the pros and cons of your type of literacy, and explain why we should move either towards or away from it, from an emancipatory literacy.
I think y'all gave some really great points towards moving to emancipatory literacy. I mean, if it's helping people learn, I don't see a downfall, especially because it's kind of broadening their worldview. A couple of presentations ago, there were the students who were playing Jeopardy with AAE, and that was kind of like broadening their worldview. Like even if you went to the school and didn't speak AAE, you were learning about a new language that you weren't familiar with, and so they were able to do this through the emancipatory literacy.
What's AAE?
Oh, African American English. Sorry, not AAVE.
So kind of just to play devil's advocate a little bit, I guess one of the dangers of emancipatory literacy might be kind of this non-standardization, like with initiatives like Common Core and things like that. We kind of have an educational system that's set up so that everybody's kind of put on the same level to some extent, like everybody has that same kind of baseline education. But like with emancipatory literacy, I think you're going to find like educational programs that are more geared towards a specific like cultural norms and things of that nature related to whatever population it targets. So I wonder if that could potentially produce a system in which certain students, even though they're receiving an education that is geared towards them, is objectively not that same quality as students who are receiving like more of a traditional literacy approach. Just putting that out there.
I want to push back on that just a little bit because I think that the standardized approach to education is the approach that's been taken with the teach for test approach, and it's failed. It's been failing for a while now, and I think that a lot of people in education policy and even just teachers are recognizing that now. And I think that emancipatory literacy gives us an interesting lens to think about how to educate people so that they can learn. And I think maybe another place that we can start kind of investing energy is thinking of ways in society that we can value those different ways of knowing and being and learning, so that it's not just a you went to college so you deserve to be paid a lot of money kind of thing, and it's a you can build a table from scratch. How do you get paid to do that?
Where do you think MIT falls on the spectrum of like emancipatory literacy and like?
I think MIT is way far on the tradition. MIT is the alt-right of traditional literacy, I think. I just think that I think that the immense pressure that falls on students, just on students' physical bodies, is definitely a symptom of a larger problem. And for me, the fact that that symptom is not enough of an impetus to change is heartbreaking. Because I think that I didn't come to college expecting it to be the best 4 years of my life, but I didn't come here also expecting to just suffer. And so I think that there's definitely got to be a way where I can bloom, can reach my best potential, and I love learning. I love school, and the fact that I have just kept running up against the institution, I think, as a creative person, has made me kind of step back and think again about emancipatory literacy and how I can do that after.
So I have a question for you, Cynthia. So given what you just said, if you were to be MIT's president, what would you change? How would you make it better, more emancipatory? Keeping in mind that there are certain goals that you have to reach in terms of, say, if you're a mechanical engineer, if you're a chemist, how would you do that? How would you advise the administration to do better on that score?
I think the very first thing I would do is have people who are more interested in research not be professors. So the ones who are interested in research should be doing research full time, and the people who are interested in teaching should teach, because I think that gives that gives people more impetus to just connect with their students and actually get to know them. And I think in that kind of environment, you would foster a safer, healthier environment for learning. Whereas if you have a professor who is more interested in winning the Nobel Prize, what do you do coming up against that? I also would have MIT think very, very hard about where the funding is coming from, what it's going to, and how that kind of fits in the global system, where MIT as an institution fits in the global system as kind of like not only an institution that does propel you to a higher class, but kind of does that at the expense of a lot of other people and systems across the globe, even if it's not directly in the area. So I think that being more critical and intentional about our values, and also maybe adding soul to the end of that,
Okay.
the end of that motto. But
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you. So I think we should move to the third question. Thank you.
The last question is, from your personal experiences or what you've seen or read about, how do you think we can improve students' experiences and confidence through intentional language use in schools? Like, what mottos do you think are working or would work? Dana.
Well, there's a model, the only one of its kind. It's in Canada. It's a Mohawk language immersion school that's K through 6. But it struggles to secure funding because it also doesn't follow a standardized Canadian curriculum. In fact, the community has sort of decolonized the curriculum, and they teach history, for instance, not Canadian history, they teach Mohawk history. And it's been really affirming for children in the community, especially a community that has its own struggles with language preservation and revitalization, and passing on the language to continued generations, especially after a history of residential schooling that, main aim was a cultural and linguistic genocide of these people. So this is a great model, but it's funded entirely by community fundraisers, and every year struggles with staying open, and it's never certain that it'll be there in the next school year, but it seems to have had a really, really positive impact on the Mohawk community in Canada. And so programs like that, I think, need to now be funded, and that involves challenging our federal and local requirements for funding. And to do that, we need to interrogate what value there is in the curricula we have standardized, and why that is considered objectively like the standard that should impart the best learning experience upon students.
Thanks. Go ahead,
Colin?
So bouncing off of that, it seems like we get to like a chicken and egg thing where the next class of students is inculcated in this like standard curriculum, goes into society, and then like perpetuates the standard curriculum back onto the young students. So I'm curious about if anyone has thoughts about how you could make knowledge about, because one of the main hurdles I see to like instituting or like interrogating the standard curriculum is just strictly about how storied America's history has been with regard to the Native American genocide, slavery, and the, for lack of a better word, meme that is manifest destiny. How do you make people aware of that on a level that they can see those things playing out today and work to interrogate that curriculum, especially if they're coming from a background where like race isn't talked about inside their family because it's an uncomfortable topic, or if they just like haven't heard about these things since high school.
For me, I feel like it boils down to like, where do you learn to interrogate your own beliefs? And I feel like that's hard to find. And to this class was like a huge part of that for me. And I don't know if that was because I sought it out, or just like I happened to stumble upon a place where I learned to interrogate my own beliefs. But I think that's a decision that each person can make for themselves. But I don't really have an answer for how we show people the value in interrogating your own beliefs, and like how much more like enriched your life is when you like learn to interrogate like your beliefs before just like attacking them.
Yeah, bouncing off of that, like I think a common theme that we come up with in this class is like, how do we have conversations with people who don't want to have these conversations? And I think like the only way for them to figure out is for them to interrogate themselves, but like most of those people won't. So like finding ways
to make them interrogate themselves, I think is going to be like a common problem like throughout history, and like unfortunately I don't know if I personally have a great like solution for that, but I think like more opportunities like this. I mean, obviously, like, you know, we mentioned this before, like the people who are taking this class were not really diversified in thought, right? Like we all sought this class out mostly. So I don't know how you can get someone who doesn't want to interrogate themselves like into a situation like this. So maybe like mandating something like this, where you have to go to like a Black history class or a Native American history class or like whatever, might force people to start talking about it.
Yeah, I almost think it might be better to not have a separate class for this is your, you know, well-roundedness class. Like this is when we're going to learn about the others. But to integrate what you would learn in a specific Black history class into the general curriculum, which of course is harder, and but I do think would require the same amount of conversations and connections and negotiations as making a requirement, you know, of a separate class. But I think that a better approach that might be more palatable and have more positive effects would be just straight up integration, decolonizing the current curriculum.
I totally.
I like, yeah.
I was going to say I totally agree with Dana. I think that. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. I totally agree with Dana because I think that the history will speak for itself. I think that history is like if you know the full history of like the United States, for example, it's pretty terrible. And I think that you do need to know the whole history and also need to get the alternative sides and have those be like integrated into the curriculum. I also was interested in, I'm thinking about like entry points into these conversations in like ways that like art and humor can function as entry points in the conversations. I've been having this conversation with a friend of mine of how like humor, for example, gives us a way to kind of express some of these things that are more taboo and kind of laugh them off and kind of like integrate them as opposed to everyone shunning them and people feeling bottled. So I'm interested about like humor and art specifically as entry points into these conversations.
Let me follow up on that bit. I mean, so thank you for that. So then I think what you said in a way answers the concern that Chope expressed, right? So because Chope put it as a dual choice, that you either do this or you do that, right? So if Dana is right, Chope, one could imagine having every class, like your traditional math class, chemistry class, all paying attention to those issues. And in fact, there is room for that. Even if you take a simple photography class, one can even think about what kind of choices go into making a camera. And actually, I have friends who are photographers, and they've explained to me that actually most cameras were not built to take pictures of Black people. So he himself, as a white photographer, he finds that when he takes a picture with his regular Canon of a white person, it comes much better than when he takes it of a Black person. Why? Because the lenses are designed with the normative gaze of the white subject. Right? So he had to tweak his camera to make it take good pictures of Black people. So even there, even in physics, there's a way to interrogate the curriculum, why certain changes are made in the lens, for example. So in a way, it could be both. You could both have the emancipatory literacy within the quote-unquote more traditional curriculum. And going back to Dana's point, you can imagine also in history, in biology you could include texts like, I mentioned earlier, this book on the mismeasure of men, you see, which goes into lots of historical issues about biology, how women's heads were measured to show that women are intelligent. At Harvard, for example, for many years, when you were coming in, you had to undress, and they would take your picture naked, and they would look at your picture to decide what kind of student you would become based on physical traits, like how big was your head. This was Harvard. You know, Agassiz was one of the most proponents of what was called then phrenology, which is the measure of. So there is plenty of room to integrate those kind of literacies within the typical curricula.
Yeah, and I want to express the fact that to do such a thing is not just to include all of the hushed historical abuses that we gloss over in our current curricula, but it's also to acknowledge the good that we have overlooked. So discoveries and innovations that other people who are not quote unquote Western and who are not Anglo-American have made and contributed to the fields of science and history and literature. So not only to recognize, these historical evils, but also the grand positive impacts that others have had.
Absolutely, absolutely. So are you guys happy with the answers? Okay, so thank you very much.